It's Shadow Talk time. Rick Holland, CISO of Digital Shadows, joins me and Richard Gold, Head of Security Engineering, to discuss the most interesting stories from the week. In part one, we discuss a security flaw in Facebook affecting 50 million users. And in part two, 1 year after reports of the Equifax breach, there's been some fines and some new findings. We discuss lessons learned. In the room with me in Dallas, I'm delighted to say we've got Rick Holland. Hello, Rick.
Hello, Michael.
And hello, Rich.
Hey, Mike.
It's lovely to all be together, if not feeling a little bit bloated from a heavy barbecue session just now.
Yes, lots of barbecue.
Let's start with the news of Facebook breach. We've got an announcement, Mark Zuckerberg saying that they've discovered an attacker exploited a technical vulnerability to steal access tokens that would allow them to log into about 50 million people's accounts. Rich, what's been going on here? What exactly is an access token and how did they get access to these?
So an access token is how you can programmatically access a web service, in this case Facebook, without having to supply a username and password. Computers are really bad at typing by themselves. They generally like to have human beings involved for that. So to get around that, we generate access tokens, which is the way to talk to a service and talk to an authenticated service. Now, what's interesting with this is that the bug seems to be a combination of bugs that were exploited, at least 2 bugs that were discussed so far. So what happened is that Facebook has this ability to called view ads, where you can view your account as somebody else in order to see if your privacy settings are working as you expect them to.
Yeah.
Now, sometimes when the people did that, a new feature which Facebook invented prompted you to upload a happy birthday video. So the happy birthday video shouldn't appear when you were using the view ads function, but sometimes it did. And the combination of these 2 things together meant that the attackers could then generate access tokens for other people's accounts. And they figured out a way to do this programmatically and bump this up to like a really big scale. And that's what caused Facebook to notice that something untoward was going on. And it's quite interesting how, for me at least, that it's not just like, oh, it was an unpatched PHP that they exploited, something obvious. This looked to be, it's a step above. So it's a pretty nice little attack.
Yeah, one thing we always discuss is not focusing on the attribution of the attacker.
It was Russia.
Attacker goal. Attacker goals. So in this case, what would you do with access tokens? How useful is a Facebook account? Like, you don't have the credentials, so you can't do account takeovers. What might you use that access for?
Well, what I think is interesting when I think about these kind of situations is like, as you said, what are the goals and what can you do with it? And with this, it's kind of interesting because you can get information about the account. So you can get the personal information about the account details. What would you do with that? And who's that useful for? And, there is some, I guess, criminal ways you could monetize that information. But for me, I would be thinking that this is really useful more for espionage, for things like, you think about the Cambridge Analytica stuff, micro-targeting, that kind of stuff, getting details on particular people or group of people.
Challenge passwords. You get all kinds of personal information. It's going to be my mother-in-law, my daughter, all kinds of stuff that you could have for, as you say, micro-attacks against individuals. It's a wealth of information for targeted attacks against people.
Yeah, I guess if we remember back to the Lazarus Group indictment, there was a lot of social media targeting on there. So just imagine if you had access to accounts, that would make it even better. What I don't get with the micro-targeting is, would you do it for 50 million accounts? Wouldn't that, because Facebook only noticed that because of such a large activity. So that doesn't quite add up.
Yeah, well, I was thinking again, like along the Cambridge Analytica lines, that you want to get a lot of information about people's accounts that you can like throw into some, machine learning monstrosity and build something out of that. That's what I would be thinking it would be useful for.
It's interesting because I think, I can't remember the exact terminology that they use, but they say attacker or third party. So there is some interesting wording around that. So I don't know what we're going to see come out of that in the future.
Yeah, there's not many details at the moment. It's still very early days. Facebook have, taken a pretty gutsy move of going quite public with this. Obviously, GDPR is forcing their hand to an extent, but they are being quite open about this. Although, this is from last year. They noticed in December 2017.
So if it was last year, does GDPR apply then? Rick, GDPR.
We'd have to check with our data privacy officer on that, which I thankfully avoided. But, enforcement for GDPR went into effect in May, right? So there's implications there. And I'm thinking from a personal level, people targeting me, I could be micro-targeted from barbecue, as my Facebook account is only filled with barbecue pictures of either things I've cooked or things I have purchased. So, yeah, if you want to socially engineer or attack me, barbecue is pretty much the easiest way to do it.
Yeah, free smoking chips available here.
Click.
Facebook have taken some actions to mitigate this. They patched the flaws, is that right? And I think they may be resetting passwords.
Yeah, they've reset the access tokens for 50 million accounts, and then everything that used a view as lookup in the last year. So it's an extra 40 million accounts. So they've got about 90 million in total, which they've basically bounced the people out of the accounts, and they're going to log in again.
So does that mean 50 million people were uploading happy birthday videos?
No.
The
happy birthday video upload occurred occasionally. That was the bug. So there was two bugs. One was the view as feature, and one was the happy birthday video feature. So those two bugs interacting together was how the attackers were able to, at scale, generate so many access tokens.
Got you. I'm glad I clarified. In contrast with the quick response by Facebook, let's talk about Equifax.
The gift that keeps on giving.
Yeah. It's been over a year since at least reports came out, but the actual breach itself happened between May and July 2017. There has been a fine by the ICO, which is the Looks at Notes, UK Information Commissioner's Office, correct, with £500,000, which doesn't seem like an awful lot.
Until you realise that that's the maximum that they can give pre-GDPR.
And we should remind ourselves that although it was,
It's the same that they fined Cambridge Analytica for as well.
Right. And it wasn't, they only got the UK jurisdiction. So that was like 15 million of the, just under 150
smaller
million.
Carve out of the total.
Only 15 million. So that doesn't really matter. But with that, not only was the news of the fines itself, but there were also some lessons learned from the ICO takeaways. But previously, a couple of weeks ago, there was the GAO findings. So I know you looked into, Rich.
Yeah. So that was a really interesting post-mortem from the GAO, the General Accounting Office here in the US. And I think that
it's nice to have you in the US, by the way.
It's great to be here. Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure. It was pretty interesting, the things that they came up with, because when the Equifax breach first happened, the whole thing was, it was Apache struts, they didn't patch. So then there was a lot of Twitter commentary of lol patch, which obviously is a gross simplification, especially with struts where you actually have to recompile your entire application in order to patch it, not just install an extra package. But the GAO report goes into the details of why they didn't patch, and that's really interesting. So the US CERT had notified them that it was going to be a requirement that there was this big vulnerability and that they should patch this. Okay, that's good. Then, so Equifax knew about it. They also notified people that this issue was needing to be taken care of, but the distribution list was not up to date. So the person responsible for that vulnerable server was not notified, so they didn't patch. And then when they scanned their environment, the scanner that they used didn't pick up that they had struts. So there was quite a lot of things, like a cascade of failures, which caused the actual issue to happen.
Well, you said one thing that we do a really good job of, and that's grossly oversimplify every single intrusion that's out there. And really, things are quite complex. And it's not black and white. Like often the Twitterverse of cybersecurity likes to do, because there's a lot of cascading failures. And not to defend anyone that has an intrusion, but I think it's a whole lot easier to be the Monday morning quarterback and have your commentary on the sidelines versus being in the trenches trying to do these things and seeing process failures that broke down or tools that didn't work effectively. It's always much more complex than we like to think.
Yeah, and they thought that they had done the right thing. And that's, I think, where the danger really is that they thought that everything was okay. They knew that the vulnerability had happened, they knew the vulnerability existed. They notified people who they thought were responsible, and then they checked to see if the issue had been dealt with.
But you say they became aware of the issue. I think in the ICA report, at least, there's one of the things that they took exception to was the fact that they didn't tell the UK arm. So they knew about it for a month before Equifax Limited actually found out about it.
Yeah, I was just referring to the Struts vulnerability itself.
Right, yeah.
Although, one of the big lessons learned when I was at Forrester, there was a piece of research that we had called Planning for Failure. And I updated it when I joined, and it continues on to this day, but is really a good example of when you look at an incident response function, how broad it needs to be. Global companies, lines of business, validation of validation. These are the types of things that are very difficult in large multinational companies. And of course, you still need to try to do it. But if you don't have a plan and you don't test that plan and you don't validate that plan, you could end up in trouble. And even if you do all those things, you could still end up in trouble.
Yeah. And in the case of Equifax, their security architecture was sadly pretty non-existent. So the fact that there was an ODA in their publicly facing struts, which meant that an attacker could get code exec on that box, if you have a decent security architecture in place, that should not be the end of the that would be the end of the story, right? But it wasn't in the case of Equifax, because from there, it was very easy for them to get everywhere inside of that environment, that internal environment, to get all of the PII and all this kind of stuff. Like, there were lots of legacy servers, there was stuff just lying around, and that was, so there was that failure as well, to think that, just focusing on the struts only, I think, is kind of missing the point. You need to have much more, defense in depth. It's nothing new, but it needs to actually be done. And the other interesting thing is that the certificate expiration was a much bigger issue than is often thought of. And certainly it's something that surprised me. So they had a SSL inspection device for checking to see if information was being exfiltrated from the environment, which shouldn't be. But because the certificate for the CA, which was used to manage that appliance, had expired, the devices that were sending the traffic just kept on sending the traffic, and the SSL appliance didn't do the inspection and just failed open. So the traffic just passed through and the appliance didn't do anything. So what happened was then, when they realized that had happened, and then they issued a new root CA cert, and everything was working normally again, then they saw that all of this terrible stuff was flowing out of the network. But there was an interesting case where the SSL or certificate expiration.
I'm going to have to stop you there, Rich, because that's 3 times you've used interesting, and we had a listener complain about the overuse of interesting. So there's going to be a monetary fine for every time any of us say interesting.
That is a very interesting comment.
It's $1 in the jar. Sorry to interrupt. Where were we?
It's always good to interrupt certificate conversations and CAs, because I think for a lot of listeners, it may be a little bit beyond their technical depth. Even go back to Forrester again, even covering encryption is a very difficult area to do. But I think it speaks to the complexity of understanding your certificates, looking for certificates that are expiring. What are the implications for that? Is a very interesting area. Drink.
Well, the thing, I think what is really interesting about that is that
I think we were making a mockery of the ban on the word now.
Never. But I think the interesting thing with that is that you tend to think of certificate expiration, as being like something which causes systems to stop working, in terms of stuff will just break and traffic will stop flowing. The fact that the appliance failed open, think is something which really surprised a lot of people. It certainly surprised me. Just don't think that an SSL inspection appliance would fail open in this case. And because you would assume that, and in this case you would have assumed incorrectly, ownage happens.
Talking of certificate errors, you may have seen that there was the voter registration process. Was it last week? At least it was for California. But the website, you log on to register your vote, certificate error, which was surprising.
Well, I think most voters probably click through that stuff because we've trained people just to click through any kind of certificate errors that are out there.
That's true. Any other takeaways from the Equifax, whether that's the ICO? I think for me, there was the stuff about where is your data being held. So I think they migrated a bunch of data from the US to UK, but they still kept that data in the US and they didn't know that it was there. And it was like data of UK citizens. So like, I got no experience of transferring databases, but how hard is that to have as a consideration, like version control of these sorts of things and where the data resides?
Well, I think actually something that Rick says quite often, which I like, is this notion of toxic data. And I think that's exactly how you should consider it, that if you're holding data, you should consider that it's toxic or radioactive or whatever kind of metaphor you want. But you really want to hold as little as possible and for as short as time as possible. So as a general principle, it's very easy to just collect stuff because you're like, oh, maybe I'll need this, or maybe like, is it backed up? I think it's backed up. I'm not sure. I'll just keep it. So it's very easy just to let stuff accumulate. And then, it's very then easy to lose track of things because just you have so much stuff to take care of.
Talking of things that sound pretty easy, a few times we mention defense in depth on the podcast and say, well, this is another sign that we should have defense in depth. And what does that mean? Can we give some
multiple partially overlapping security controls, both technical and non-technical?
What would be an example of those? Could we run through some specifics of that for people that may be listening?
Yeah. So, for example, you have a firewall which is on the perimeter of your network between your internal network and your upstream. So that's one place where you do traffic filtering. Maybe you then also have host-based firewalls as well on your machines as well. Maybe they serve a different purpose, but they're partially overlapping.
Well, the worst example historically is I need to have multiple AV engines on my gateway appliances because that's going to be defense in depth and it's going to protect me. I actually rail against defense in depth because, and you've probably both heard me use this term, for many organizations, defense in depth turns into expense in depth where I just buy more junk. And I buy more junk without maximizing the existing tools that I have. And then meanwhile, I don't really have a purposeful layered defense. I've bought 6 different tools that 5 of them have overlap. I don't maximize them. I don't get training on them. I don't get professional services to implement them. And then a lot of times vendors will use a defense in depth to sell you more of whatever their widgets are. And like for us, we're going through budget season right now. In fact, it's one of the reasons Rich is in Dallas with us is for internal security planning and looking at our security stack and making sure that we have gotten every ounce of the juice out of the fruit. That's the greatest analogy I've ever used before. You guys can use that if you want, the juice out of the fruit. I think there's a more elegant way to say that, to make sure we're maximizing all the investment that we have and look at layered defenses because it is a good idea. But I actually think most people need to first make sure maximize everything that they've already got before they start adding more things to the mix, which then adds more complexity to the environment, which then to tie it back to Equifax, now I have a much more complex environment and it's much more difficult to defend. So, keep defense in depth in mind, but be wary of expense in depth.
I think it's a really good point. I think that you can...
It's an interesting point.
It's very interesting. It was certainly piqued my interest. Very nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you don't have to necessarily be spending money on expensive appliances with blinky lights in order to have layered defenses, to make sure. So another example, right? You have an antivirus on your machine, but then you also have hardening policies that you can apply to the machine. For example, PowerShell constrained language mode. You have, you can block Windows script hosting. You can block macros. You can block DDE, early embedding, all these kinds of things. So you are taking, you're not taking any chances, right? You have different ways you're attacking the problem of code execution from different angles, and all of these things together give you a resilient security posture, which is not what Equifax had, for example.
I smell a blog here: defense in depth without spending money.
Let's do it.
Coming soon.
But that is all for this podcast. We are out of time. Does anybody have any burning issues or wrap up statements that they want to contribute? Don't rush forward.
I think with Facebook breaking today, just like anything else, incident response, and Equifax was similar. When things break, it takes a while for incident response to occur. People find more things as an ongoing investigation, and whenever there's any type of crises, everyone always jumps to conclusions and things like that. More details will follow.
Yeah, I think with the Facebook one, it's pretty clear that they are a very hot target. A lot of people are very interested in them. They clearly have a lot of very valuable data to a lot of different groups, people, organizations, and this is probably not going to be the last time that we'll see some quite high-profile attack against them.
Okay, and thanks for joining us both. Lovely to have you all in the same room. And thanks to you at home for listening. Have a good week.